Yeah, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. As you can see, I'm here to talk about Hellblade. And yeah, just our general approach to combat animation, pretty much from a high level. I'm not going to go into too many technical details or anything, so hopefully you can take something away from this, even if you're not an animator. So, who am I? My name's Goodall. Yeah, I started at Ninja Theory in 2009 as an animation intern, and I never left. Since then, I've worked on Enslaved, Odyssey to the West, DMC, and some of the Infinity games. So there was Infinity 2.0, which was some of the Marvel characters, and yeah, the Star Wars stuff. So next I'm going to show you just a brief overview of the animation work I did on the project, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the, just the variety of characters and the issues we had to tackle. Can you adjust the audio?
Shh.
And return back to idle. So this is how the character just gets back to their default fighting pose, ready to perform the next attack. So, onto reference. Well, this is a digital art conference, so I'm sure the artists here have heard multiple times that collecting and analyzing reference will help a great deal. For me, it's an important part of my workflow, and I rarely start without it. I almost always get better results with a little planning. When it comes to planning for combat, it's really helpful to look for good choreography, whether it's from any classic martial arts movies or combat sports like UFC, boxing, just anything you can find. Now, I'm no martial arts expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do like to record video of myself doing basic things like punches, kicks, sword strikes. Just, I haven't got anything. And I just try simple choreography to see how the strikes can flow and just get a feel for it. I find that if it feels super awkward for me to do it, then it usually comes across as really awkward in the game. When I quickly get out of my depth, or I'm looking for a specific style, I'll search through YouTube just to find examples which closely fit what I'm looking for. Some people also like to do small thumbnail drawings of the poses, or they have little mannequins that they pose. It's like whatever works for you. I suck at drawing, so I prefer to just grab a camera and act it out. Again, don't worry about this step being perfect. It's just reference for you. No one else has to see it. And besides, it can't really look any worse than this. Yeah, you might recognize that one from the start. Okay, so now that reference is sorted, it's time to create a first pass. So this is basically a blocking pass where the aim is to get the animation to a functional working state, which means that you should be able to implement it into the game engine and it will work. It'll be a little bit rough, but it should communicate everything you're trying to do. So this is basically kind of like a rough sketch before filling in the details. This pass should generally just consist of a few key poses with the intended timing of the action. What's important right now is getting your idea into the game as quickly as possible, and I'm looking for the first impression of how it feels, flows together at this early stage, along with how it reads in the context of the game with the game camera. So, like the Ryu reference I gave, I just put in the anticipation pose, the strike pose, and just generally the settle. If I'm working on a bigger sequence of attacks, like a combo, I'll usually just do all of them together, just to get the flow of the choreography, and then I'll split those up into individual attacks before implementing them. I don't usually add any additional keys between the settle and idle pose, so no feet placement or weight shifts or any details. Just a rough indication of the timing I want as it blends between the two poses. After this, it's time to add it to the engine, get it working correctly, set up. I'll also add quickly like placeholder VFX and camera shake, anything that's going to help support the idea. So here's an example of a first pass keyframe animation in the engine. I've added some red markers to the poses I added. As you can see, it's nothing special, but there we've got that anticipation, the strike, and then yeah, he just hangs out there and just blends back to his idle pose. That's all you need. They're just like, 4 poses. Okay, so that was the keyframe approach. This is an example of what the motion capture looks like on one of our anime characters. So a first pass for motion capture data for me differs from keyframe, as I'm really just focusing on what I want to fix, what I know is going to be an issue in the game, like before I add it. So this is an example of what the raw data kind of looks like on a character, like with just no real cleanup or anything. So it's not bad. It's not super rough. The main problem with that example is the weapon. Like, it doesn't hit straight. It doesn't really look like a strike. Obviously, he doesn't go back to his idle pose, and it could do with being a little bit more punchy just for gameplay. So here's what the first cleanup looks like. So now you see the strike actually just reads a lot better. So after this, it's on to the most important part of the whole process. And that is play the game, really. It doesn't matter how good you think it looks in Maya or whatever 3D package you're using, until you see it in the context of the game, you can't really tell if it's going in the right direction. In the game, there's also an element of feel, which is something you don't get when you're just animating stuff in Maya. I'll talk more about feel later. At this point, it's important to get some feedback from a designer to see if it fits their needs. It's important to do it at this stage, not only because it will stop you from taking the animation too far and having to change it, thus wasting more precious time in your schedule, but it will also allow other departments such as design, effects, and audio to get to work with their own first-pass work. This in turn helps by eliminating any bottlenecks which may occur as a result of everyone waiting for you to finish your animation masterpiece. The creation of video games is very much a team effort, and having an understanding of the processes that come after you in the pipeline will help everyone create a final better product. So on to iteration. Now that you've played the game and everything is working well, if not, go back to your first pass and do it again. It's time to make it a bit pretty. I basically always start with getting the weight of the character feeling right by taking the cog control, so that's the green control around her waist. It's the center of mass. And then I work outwards from there to hands, feet, head, everything. I just need to get that weight working first. I add things like the return to idle. I'll push the poses and timing to make them a bit more dynamic, but importantly without affecting the core timing of strikes. Make sure everything is reading well, track the weapon arcs, so the weapon arcs is the path the weapon will follow in the game. Just generally try to lock down the body mechanics so it looks solid and is a close representation of the final version. Then again, played in game, analyze, get some more critique, and just keep going from there. The key here is that because we did most of the setup in our first pass stage, all you're going to do is just replace the same animation, which makes iteration super quick. It should be playable at all times, and anyone should just be able to play the game and see the state of the work that's there. All you're doing is iterating on the quality at this point. Yay, more video reference. So here's a quick example of an attack I did for Revenant, which includes the reference I took, the first pass, and then another iteration after seeing him playing it in game. So elegant. So this is an example where the movement was quite complex, so I had to put a little bit more time and effort into the first pass than I would usually, compared to the in-game example I showed earlier. Yay! So that's basically what it looks like from my video reference. I just, used it to get the rough motion down. Yeah, there's some real-time cloth simulation there, just to hide all the bad animation I did. So yeah, after seeing this in game, I found the swords were getting lost in the cloth dynamics, interestingly, so I had to make the strikes a little bit bigger. So I ended up with something like this. As you can see, it's still quite similar, but it flows a lot better. I made some just slight changes to the timing. The attacks were more diagonal, which I found worked a lot better. Vertical strikes just get lost in all the cloth dynamics. So this is one of the reasons why it's important to try it in game first before you take it too far, because I would have never seen that, because I didn't have dynamics in Maya. Actually, in Maya, he's just totally naked. It's kind of weird. So yeah, that works much better. So before we actually start animating some cool combat, it's important to understand a few basic principles of how it works from a gameplay perspective and what our constraints and requirements are. So I've broken this down to 3 main pillars. These pillars are response, clarity, and progression. So response. One of the most important factors in combat is the responsiveness and feel. Gameplay is king, and the player wants to focus on playing the game and not waiting for an animation to catch up with their inputs. This involves a back and forth between the designer, like what the designer wants for gameplay, and what looks good to the animator. Like, does it fit within the aesthetics of the project? It's not uncommon for an attack to require as little as 4 or 5 frames, like in a game such as DMC, from the press of a button to the player character hitting its target. Response is also the main element that separates animation for playable and non-playable characters. For playable characters, the button press essentially replaces the majority of the anticipation part of the attack. The player has pressed the button and expects the action. If the player presses the button and then the character takes extra time to wind up their attack and then strike, it's going to feel a little bit sluggish and unresponsive. Having some kind of immediate directional movement through space also adds to the response. I think this is the immediate movement is a good rule of thumb that applies to the first 1 or 2 hits in any combo just to get the attack started, or any defensive action such as evading or blocking. If we were to follow the same method for NPCs, or the non-playable characters, then it would feel unfair, as the attacks would pretty much be impossible to react to. They would just hit you without any warning. So, clarity. Each attack or action should have one clear gameplay function. That function is decided by the designer, and then it's our job as animators to communicate that as clearly as possible. Also, it's going to be quite difficult to communicate any kind of anticipation, those 4 or 5 frames that I mentioned earlier, like in DMC, without it looking like a complete mess. So, in order to solve this, and to make every frame count, we actually build some anticipation into the strike movement, and then we spend more time communicating at the end of the action what the player just did. That way, as long as you have the enemy's reaction to the strike and then this pose of the character, your mind kind of just fills in the blanks between the two. In the case of the non-playable characters, we take the opposite approach and spend more time creating an anticipation or a tell at the start of the attack to communicate with the player what's going to happen and allow you to respond accordingly. At the end of the action, it's a good rule of thumb to allow as much recovery time. So for an NPC, this means how long it takes them to get ready again to attack. So allow as much recovery time as was allowed for the anticipation at the start of the strike. I'm just going to talk a little bit about camera in here. So along with the strong poses and silhouettes, great timing, clean motion arcs, it's also important to consider our in-game camera position. This is basically one of the principles of animation called staging. The camera in Hellblade is very close to the player and in a fixed position, which creates a number of things to consider when creating attacks to make sure everything is readable and doesn't get obscured by the edges of the screen, or, in the case of non-playable characters, obscured by Senua. You can see in this diagram, coming on the next slide, where the strengths and weaknesses of the framing are. So the green section is our optimal area. Anything which comes in this part of the screen, like, you're probably going to see it. The white box is just the area we should try and stay within. And then the red part is the part which is kind of obscured. Senua's there, and if there are any enemy attacks from that side, you're probably not going to see it because she's going to be covering the strike. Saying that, we do things in the red part sometimes just to make attacks harder to read. try and keep the player on their toes. Nothing too punishing, but it adds an air of unpredictability, and it would just get a bit samey if everything came within that green box. So progression. To keep combat fun and rewarding, attacks should follow some kind of interesting progression. So a variety of strike angles and directions, speed, timing, strength and damage, distance. Progression is the combination of all of these points and ultimately rooted in a sense of rhythm. I like to think of this in a musical way, so the same thing that makes music interesting also applies in animation. So here, if you have a beat which is just 4 claps, where every beat has the same timing and intensity, so like, it's not very interesting, it's monotonous. Like, adding a simple change where we make the second and third clap close together and make the final clap a bit louder, it becomes a bit interesting. So. Also, that final clap gives a sense of resolution to the sequence. You can see this in game where we're basically replacing the claps with button presses and the sound with visual feedback. The only difference is you don't have to be as accurate with the button presses to get the same result. So now I'm going to move on to the combat case studies. Just a little breakdown of Senua. So first, a little bit about her personality. She's feral, wild, but still precise and calculated. We often said that if she was an animal, she would be a wolf. She's in tune with her body and limits, and she doesn't hesitate or stumble or really lose control. She's battling her emotions, isn't totally in control, and treads a fine line to overcome emotional instability. This is really emphasized with the audio in the game, having her screaming and shouting as she's doing her attacks. And also, she's a skilled fighter and a well-trained swordmaster. So style. Style's obviously fairly realistic, so nothing that would look out of place in real life, such as air juggling, doing super jumps, double jumps, all this stuff, which is a bit gamey. We needed to pay a lot of attention to the weight and momentum and the sense of impact that we were creating. It had to be believable within the world we had established. Her movements and style of fighting should somewhat fit within the context of her world. With realism in mind, actions tend to take a little longer to help support this where possible, but without sacrificing the feel and response of the game. If you've ever looked for realistic sword fighting online, which I have, you may be surprised to find that realistic sword fighting is very quick and dirty and definitely a lot less romantic than it's portrayed in media. So, to help keep things appealing and readable, we steered away from that and more towards what you might expect from movies and other games. For anyone wondering what more realistic sword fighting looks like, here's an example. So, I mean, there's no doubt that that's probably effective, but it's not going to play very well in game, and it's not super interesting to watch. So, reference. Here are some of the style references we looked at for a number of different reasons. So, for TV and film, we had things like the series Vikings and Game of Thrones. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Game of Thrones. I hear it's really popular. So the Brienne of Tarth versus the Hound fight was a great reference, so it's those guys in the image. The whole fight is very grounded and raw, and it seems like a big struggle for both characters. You have no idea who's going to win, so in true Game of Thrones fashion, anyone can win, regardless of your emotional investment in them. And there's a lot of back and forth. They also fight dirty, using any means necessary to win. This is the kind of feel we wanted to go for in Hellblade. For those of you who haven't seen it, here's what it looks like. If you're not that far into Game of Thrones, then spoilers. The next part's a touch violent, so if you're squeamish, cover your eyes. So yeah, that's the kind of tone we were going for. But it's really about the back and forth, right? It needs to feel like a struggle. You don't know if the enemy's going to win or if you're going to win, and yeah, that pretty much sums that up. So back onto reference. The Revenant. We, like the whole team, we went to see the Revenant. Like, it was my second time, and it was a great study in the camera work because of the long continuous shots, and also how personal and close the camera is to the characters. It creates a greater connection and sense of being there, which is part of the mood and tone of the movie, and also something we were going for. Our video games, Bloodborne. So Bloodborne has that dark feel. The animation is not super realistic, but it's good, clean, readable poses, and in terms of timing, it's something a lot closer to what we wanted for the style of Hellblade, much closer than DMC was. Dead Space 2, it has some pretty gruesome but great melee moments. The camera position is very similar to what we were going for in Hellblade, like third person over the shoulder. So it was a useful study. It was useful to study how the team behind it approached this aspect of the game. So, let's have a look at Senua's light combo, and I'll try and break it down using some of the combat pillars. So this is one of Senua's basic bread and butter combos that doesn't require any time button presses, which means you can just mash on X to perform it. So if you're not very good at fighting games, this is the one. It's fairly quick and responsive, but it doesn't deal a lot of damage to the enemy. Let's play it for you. So let's have a look at the individual attacks and we'll see what's happening. So this is attack 1, I'll just play it through once for you. Right, so to break this down, we have our immediate forward movement on the button press where she steps forward. I mean, that was really, really fast. What this is doing is basically the forward movement is masking the root motion scaling which is happening to make sure she can hit the enemy. So there's code underneath which is just moving her capsule so that she's guaranteed to hit the opponent. You can see that she gets to the anticipation pose here in only a few frames, and the strike happens quite quickly, so it's probably around 8 frames or so. We're building the anticipation into the forward movement, and then the strike goes from right to left because it blends well from her idle position. This is pretty much the most economical movement she can make in the short time that we have before the hit. The post-strike pose is clear to communicate what the player just did. And then we get the settle and return to idle, at which point the player can break out of the attack animation into just the generic movement or whatever they want to do. The breakout for the next attack happens pretty much at this point here, and yeah. So on to attack 2. So this attack is pretty similar. It's pretty similar in terms of timing and movement distance to the first. The only main difference is that it starts with the sword on the left and the strike goes left to right. Here we're using the pose from the end of the previous strike, to help with the anticipation and economy of movement. The strike is something that you would naturally expect her to do logically from the last one. So on to attack 3. Here we have got a much more dynamic pose to start from. The attacks are starting to open up and feel a lot bigger and stronger, and we're being more lenient with the timings to give Senua more time to put her weight into the strike and change the feel and rhythm. The forward movement window is a little bit slower than the previous 2, and the strike hits a bit later. Even though this strike is similar to the first one in terms of direction, the angle of the sword and the angle of the sword is different, and she has a slightly bigger settle. There's just enough changes to make it feel like a stronger version of the first attack. So attack 4. This is the final strike. Here we've given Senua even more time to put her weight into the attack. She has more space for anticipation at this point because the response isn't that important. The enemy is playing a hit reaction, so you're guaranteed to hit them basically without any interruption. Again, we've been more lenient with the forward movement, and the strike hits later than all the previous ones. So somewhere around frame 20. So if you compare that to the first, frame 8, last frame 20, it's a big difference. Thanks, YouTube. So there you have the wind up, and a much stronger hit. And yeah, she takes a lot longer to settle back. There has to be an easier way of doing this. Yeah, third time lucky. Right, so let's look at the attacks for one of our enemies. Right, this is Surt. He's one of the bosses you'll encounter in the game, and he's basically a big mythical fire giant with a flaming sword. So his behavior, he basically fits into the tank archetype of character, which is a character that trades speed and maneuverability for strength and health. His high-level purpose in the game is to get the player to dodge and also to teach the focus mechanic in a combat scenario. So some challenges. The size of the character in relation to movement speed was an issue. Senua is much, much faster than he is, so it was quite difficult initially for him to keep up with her. And we had a tough time between making him too punishing or too easy. There's a very fine line with how we allow his attacks to link. The sword and character size made it very difficult to read his attacks from close range because you would lose the silhouette to the side of the screen or through Senua. It was also really easy to evade around him without being hit from close range. It would also take so long to recover and turn around that you could get to his back and attack, which is something he didn't really have an answer for. But we later fixed this with a few AoE attacks, so it's like an area of effect where he hits the floor or roars and pushes the player back so he can get to the optimal range again. So earlier I spoke about design documents. Like, here's basically what a design document looks like. It's not super fancy. It breaks down all the moves that we want the character to do. So at the top, the swipe combo. It says that we want 2 horizontal diagonal swipes, which, okay, seems pretty straightforward. There's some special properties on there which were later removed, and also a third attack which should cover a range of 270 degrees. Followed up by a ground slam, which is described as a vertical overhead strike. So 4 attacks in total. Let's see how this ended up looking in the game.
Excuse, bro.
Oh, can't touch me. Okay, so why did I choose to do it like this? So just like with the Senua light combo, I'll do a quick breakdown of each of these attacks. So this is attack 1. So as you can see, it's a simple upwards diagonal strike. It covers the area directly in front of him. It blends well from his idle pose. Reads well as it's in the optimal camera zone. And he steps forward to help cover enough distance and also expand his strike range, which also covers that root scaling I was talking about earlier. This attack always leads into attack 2. So the strike, anticipation and wind-up flows naturally from the first attack. He's got a slightly longer anticipation than the attack before, but with a much faster swipe. It's similar to the first in terms of range and functionality, so he advances on the player for more range. And unlike the first attack, this one can actually return back to his idle position or follow up with the third if needed. This helped with balancing, so we can make him more or less aggressive, just to add some variety. So attack 3. So yeah, this strike covers more area for a better chance of hitting the player and to encourage evading backwards. He steps forward and spins. The step forward and spin is used to create more range, but also to mask the character target rotation and root motion scaling. So you can see in this example, he was facing the wrong direction anyway, and yeah, that spin is just helping mask the fact that the whole character is spinning on the spot. It's more difficult to avoid than the previous attacks, so slightly longer recovery to allow the player more hits. And again, like the second, he can go back to his idle position or follow up with the final attack. This case in particular was one where it made him feel really hard and punishing, because if he hit you with this attack and he leads into the fourth, you couldn't avoid it and you would just die. So it's not super fair. So this is the fourth, the ground slam. So yeah, this is the strongest attack. It's got a long, clear overhead anticipation and wind up. Not yet. Yeah, it's designed to hit a backwards evade. The character movement and pose is designed to hide some of the root scaling and character rotation. So you can see in slow motion at the start. See that the whole character is just pivoting around there? That's the root motion scaling we were talking about. And I put him onto one foot to just make it less obvious. I mean, when it's played in real time in the game, it looks, you don't notice it as much, but I made that choice to have him stand on one leg to just try and avoid some of that. He's got the longest recovery at this point, which gives the player the best chance to get in and do some extra damage after successfully evading it. There's also some camera shake and ground effects at the end to make it just make it feel more powerful than the rest. The recovery and the emphasis, just like with Senua, it just makes it look like it's the last attack in the sequence, and you don't expect anything else. That's basically covering it. If anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them now.
I'm just wondering where we got the name from. The name for the main character.
For Senua?
Yeah.
So he was wondering where we got the name for the main character from. Honestly, I don't really know. I would have to ask the director. He just came in and went, "Hey, she's called Senua."
Because in Norway we have a name called Sunniva, so I was just wondering if that's like a reference.
It more than likely is, I would say. I mean, we were looking at a lot of that stuff. So obviously we have Surt, and we had the Valraven and Vilmeid and things like this. They're all from like Norse mythology.
I think that the Hellblade function in the game reveals where the name comes from. I think it's from a newly discovered god or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Or something.
Yeah, there are some like spoilers, but there are lodestones in the game which will answer any questions about mythology you may have. So yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Did you use any real-time IK solutions for certain parts in the game? Like foot contacts and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the question was, did we use any real-time IK solutions for foot contacts in the game? We did. It wasn't super necessary. We only used them on the enemies because you don't really see Senua's feet very often, and the combat arenas are quite flat, like for this reason. But we needed it for additive layers. So we have character states where the character is injured, and so we just have this additive animation on top, which is just kind of bending them down slightly, making them breathe heavier and stuff. And we were adjusting the cog, so it's the center of gravity control. So if you move that down in the world, the feet are going to go through the floor, and just weird stuff starts happening. So we had to use IK to just plant them on the ground. And the IK was basically used for that reason, mainly just for additive animations, not really to deal with the terrain. Yes, Toby.
How did you determine which animations should be motion captured and which should be keyframe?
So, how did I determine which animation should be motion captured and which should be keyframed? Roll the dice. Coin flip. No, well, for some characters, so for instance, in my demo reel at the start, the guy with all the cloth physics, the Raven guy, there's some moves that people just can't do. So anything which is, impossible to perform, you kind of just, there's no option but to keyframe it. And and also sometimes we went through the motion capture data and we didn't really find anything that fit. It looks cool in the studio when you're shooting it and you see these awesome stunt people jump around and do stuff. You're like, oh, it's gonna look amazing when you put it in the game. And then you put it in the engine and you're just like, oh, it's nowhere near as cool. It just seems slow and like this. So yeah, sometimes we will modify the motion capture so much that it just ends up being purely keyframe animation. But yeah, we would just go on a case-by-case basis like that. A lot of motion capture was used for things like reactions or anything like taunts and general movement, things which tend to take a long time to keyframe. Attacks were a lot easier to keyframe than that stuff. So yeah, it was just a case-by-case basis. If we could find awesome motion capture, cool, we'll use it. If not, then yeah, we're not scared to go in and just animate by hand. Yeah, you at the back?
Did you use Q1IK or some specific rig you built?
No, it was... oh yeah, so the question was, did we use human IK or any other...
What's the rigging system like?
No, we didn't use anything in particular, we just did it through blueprints. We didn't have any cool rigging stuff on the characters. I've seen all that, like the iKinema solutions and things like that, and they look awesome, and I would love to have a go with those. But yeah, we just didn't really have the resources for it at the time, and it seemed a bit overkill for what we needed. Like in the future, if we needed it, yeah, we'd go ahead. But yeah, it was just all simple blueprint based things. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was wondering how closely you were working together with the guys who did the design for the character in terms of problems that could occur down the line, like clipping. Can you talk about that?
Okay, so to repeat the question, it was how closely did we work with the character artists?
Designers.
When you say character, do you mean just the people who are like concepting and then sculpting the
Yes,
whole?
exactly.
Okay.
Because like, in one of the last animations, you saw her hand probably clipping with the bag she got on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Damn it. Who did that? Yeah. Actually, this is a really important part of production. I would work quite closely with character modelers and designers because it's really a back and forth effort. So like, I don't know if you remember my demo reel at the start again. I don't know if I should go back to the start and show. No, but there was the quadruped, right? And when it was first modeled, the arms were really too short, and like I got a first pass and I had to go through and just pose it and like, how is this guy going to animate? How does he move? And then you just find issues with, oh well, the shoulders don't work properly. He looks silly when he's stood in this position, like, or the toes are too long, or he can't actually perform the function that he's designed for. So with doing like strikes, he couldn't hit in front of him past his face because his head's so big. So we had to go back, make his arms a little bit bigger, and then I had to solve that in animation by just turning him sideways a little bit more and things like this. With the head bag, that was like added afterwards. So we'd done a bunch of stuff, and it's the same with the sword holder as well. Often they'll just make modifications and then it just starts clipping through the animation. It's like, well, do I go through all the animations and just move the arm out just because you made the sword holster a little bit bigger? Like, we need to find a mid-ground between this. Like, we're never going to solve it properly. Yeah, there's a compromise, basically, on all departments. Like, so yeah, I hope that answers your question. Anybody else? You don't get to talk? Yeah. Do you have a serious question?
Yeah. Can you show us the demo reel again?
You want to see my demo reel again?
Quite some good faces here. So.
Okay. So if you missed it, here it is again. This was the guy.